David had always valued the quiet escape his cabin by the lake provided. It wasn't a lavish property, but it was tucked away in a corner where he could sit on the porch, listen to the soft rustle of the trees, and watch the ripples dance across the water. After years of working long hours in the city, this retreat meant more to him than anything. It was his sanctuary, a place he had purchased outright and maintained with care. One bright Saturday afternoon, while David was fixing a loose board on the porch steps, a familiar figure appeared on the gravel path. Karen, a member of the neighborhood HOA, approached with a determined stride and a clipboard in hand. David straightened, brushing off his hands, and greeted her politely. "Afternoon, Karen," he said. Karen barely nodded, her eyes scanning the cabin as though she were appraising it for herself. She cleared her throat. "I'll get straight to the point, David. I've gone ahead and reserved your cabin for next weekend. We're hosting the HOA social here, and it'll be perfect for about 100 guests." David blinked, thinking he'd misheard. "Excuse me, reserved my cabin." "Yes," Karen replied matter-of-factly, flipping through her clipboard as though the decision had already been finalized. "The clubhouse is far too small, and this location is much better suited for a gathering of this size. I've already spread the word. People are very excited." David set his tools down, steadying himself before responding. "Karen, this isn't community property. This cabin is privately owned. I bought it, I maintain it, and it isn't available for reservations." Karen frowned as if his words were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "David, you're being unreasonable. Think of the community spirit. This is exactly the kind of event that brings neighbors together. Besides, the lakefront view will make it unforgettable. You should be honored we chose your place." "I'm not honored," David replied firmly, though his voice stayed calm. "I'm telling you directly, this cabin isn't part of the HOA facilities. You can't schedule events here." Her expression tightened, and for a moment, David could almost see her rehearsing her next argument. Finally, she said, "You'll regret this, David. People won't take kindly to someone refusing a community event, especially when everyone's already counting on it." With that, she turned sharply and marched back down the gravel path, muttering under her breath about selfish property owners. David exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. He had known Karen to be persistent, but this was a new level of boldness. That evening, as David sat on his porch sipping coffee, he replayed the conversation in his mind. It didn't sit right with him. The way she had spoken made it clear that she didn't see his refusal as the end of the matter. He had a gnawing feeling that this was only the beginning of a larger issue. The next morning, his suspicion was confirmed. As he walked down the lane to check his mailbox, he found a brightly colored flyer tucked among the usual bills and catalogs. In bold letters it read, "Lakefront HOA Social hosted by Karen. Location, David's cabin." David stared at the paper, both frustrated and amused. He hadn't agreed to anything, yet Karen was advertising his property as the official venue. The flyer even promised games, food, and ample space for 100 guests. His jaw tightened, but he didn't tear the flyer up. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket, already deciding to start documenting everything. Later that afternoon, he noticed a pair of neighbors walking by, chatting about how excited they were for the upcoming event. One of them glanced toward the cabin and said, "It'll be perfect out here." David nodded politely but didn't correct them, not yet. He returned to the porch, sat down with his notebook, and began writing the date, time, and details of his encounters with Karen. Experience had taught him that when dealing with bold personalities, it was always wise to keep a clear record. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, David felt a strange mix of irritation and determination. Karen might think she could push him into opening his cabin to 100 uninvited guests, but he knew better. His cabin was his own, and if she insisted on pressing this charade, she would only expose herself. For now, he resolved to remain patient. He wouldn't escalate things. He wouldn't lose his temper. Instead, he would wait, watch, and prepare for what was shaping up to be an unforgettable clash between Karen's ambition and his quiet determination to protect what was his. The following week moved slowly, but the cabin's peaceful rhythm was interrupted by the constant buzz of neighbors chatting about the big HOA event. Everywhere David went, someone mentioned it. At the small general store near town, he overheard a pair of residents talking about how they couldn't wait to see the lakefront decorated. On his walk back, 2 others discussed bringing food and chairs. It seemed Karen's flyers had worked their charm. Everyone was convinced his cabin was the official venue. By Wednesday, David had collected 4 different versions of the flyer, each with slight updates. One announced live music, another promised kayak races, and a third boldly advertised ample parking at the cabin. David chuckled at that one, knowing his narrow gravel driveway could barely handle 3 vehicles at once. But beneath his amusement, frustration simmered. Corinne wasn't backing down. She was building momentum, and soon 100 guests might actually appear at his gate expecting a party. On Thursday morning, as David tended to his garden by the porch, Corinne arrived again. This time, she wasn't alone. She had 2 board members trailing behind her, Martha, who always seemed too timid to say much, and Greg, who had a reputation for siding with Corinne on most things. "David," Corinne began with her usual authoritative tone, "I've come to finalize the arrangements for this weekend. We'll need access to the cabin Friday evening for setup. Chairs, tables, sound equipment, you know the works. Don't worry, the HOA will take care of the cleaning afterward." David set down the watering can, stood straight, and calmly replied, "No setup. There is no event happening here, Corinne. I've told you once already. This cabin isn't available for community gatherings." Greg folded his arms. "Come on, David, it's one afternoon. Everyone's looking forward to it." Martha shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet, her eyes darting between them. Corinne pressed forward. "You're being unreasonable. You can't seriously deny your neighbors the use of such a perfect location. Think of the goodwill it will bring. And frankly," she added with a sharp edge to her voice, "it's selfish to refuse when you have the space just sitting here unused most of the year." David took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. "Corinne, you don't get to decide how I use my property. This is private, not community, not for rent, and not for reservation. If people show up here this weekend, they'll find a locked gate." For the first time, Martha spoke softly. "Maybe we should reconsider, Corinne, if David isn't comfortable." But Corinne cut her off quickly. "Nonsense. He'll come around. He's just playing hard to get. Let's go." With that, she turned on her heel and marched back toward the road, Greg following and Martha trailing reluctantly behind. David stood still, his jaw tight. He had hoped reason would work, but Corinne was determined to bulldoze through his refusal. That night, David sat at his desk inside the cabin and pulled out his phone. He called the county office to double-check property lines and legal rights. The clerk confirmed what David already knew. His land was private, his deed clear, and no HOA had the authority to commandeer it. Reassured, David saved the contact numbers for local deputies as well, just in case the situation spiraled. By Friday morning, evidence of Corinne's planning began to appear. A truck drove slowly past the cabin, the driver craning his neck as if measuring the space. A group of neighbors walked by carrying folding chairs, chatting about where they might set them up. One even waved cheerfully at David and said, "See you at the party tomorrow." David only nodded politely, deciding not to reveal his hand yet. The time for explanations had passed. Now it was time to let Corinne's plans collide with reality. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, David walked down to the end of his driveway. He inspected the wide gate he had installed months ago for security and checked the heavy chain and padlock he'd purchased earlier in the week. With one final tug, he made sure everything was secure. Standing there, he imagined the scene tomorrow. Cars lined up, guests bewildered at the locked gate, Corinne scrambling to explain why the venue was off-limits. He almost felt sorry for the neighbors who had been misled. Almost. As he walked back to the cabin porch, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He wasn't a man who sought confrontation, but this time, Corinne had pushed too far. Tomorrow would be the day her schemes unraveled, and David was ready to expose the truth for everyone to see. Saturday morning dawned bright and warm, the kind of day that begged for a lakeside gathering. Birds sang cheerfully in the tall pines, and a gentle breeze rippled across the water. David brewed his coffee, sat on the porch with Max at his feet, and listened to the quiet. It was almost hard to believe that chaos was about to arrive. By 9 o'clock, the first car appeared at the end of the lane. A shiny SUV pulled up slowly, its driver leaning forward to read the handmade wooden sign David had hung on the gate. Private property, no access beyond this point. The SUV idled for a moment, then reversed down the road, clearly confused. David sipped his coffee. "One down," he murmured to Max. But more vehicles soon followed. By 10, A line of cars stretched along the gravel road leading to the gate. Families stepped out, adjusting sun hats and carrying coolers. Some peered up the driveway, pointing toward the cabin, as if wondering why no one was setting up. Then came Corinne. Her silver sedan pulled up briskly, and she stepped out dressed in a crisp summer dress, a clipboard in hand as though she were directing a festival. She walked confidently toward the gate, her heels clicking against the gravel. She stopped short when she saw the heavy chain and lock, her brow furrowing. "What is this?" she exclaimed, loud enough for several neighbors to hear. David rose from his porch chair, walked down the driveway, and stopped just behind the gate. "Morning, Corinne," he called evenly. "This is my property. As I said before, no event is happening here today." Corinne laughed lightly, though her smile was tight. "David, stop being dramatic. People are here ready to celebrate. Open the gate and let us in." "I'm not opening anything," David replied calmly. "Everyone here has been misled. This isn't the venue. I never agreed to host." The murmurs behind Corinne grew louder. Guests shifted uneasily, realizing something was wrong. A man with a picnic basket frowned. "Wait, what do you mean? The flyer said this cabin was reserved." Corinne turned quickly, her voice honeyed. "Of course it's reserved. There must be some misunderstanding. Just give me a moment." She spun back toward David, lowering her voice. "You're embarrassing yourself. Think about how unreasonable this looks." David leaned against the gate, arms folded. "I'm not the one who printed flyers with false promises. You brought this on yourself, Corinne." A woman near the back spoke up nervously. "Corinne, did he actually agree to this?" Corinne's cheeks flushed. She tried to laugh it off. "Naturally, he's just having second thoughts. You know how some people can be." But David shook his head slowly, his voice carrying so everyone could hear. "No second thoughts, no agreement. I told Corinne clearly this cabin is private, not for community events. I never gave permission." She chose to ignore that. The crowd erupted in confused chatter. Some people looked irritated, others embarrassed. A teenager muttered, "We hauled all this stuff for nothing." Corinne's composure began to crack. She tapped her clipboard nervously, then raised her voice to regain control. "Listen, everyone, there's no need to worry. We'll work this out. David is simply—" But David cut in firmly. "No, Corinne, there's nothing to work out. The gate stays locked. Everyone deserves the truth. You misled your neighbors, and now they see it." The silence that followed was heavy. Greg, the board member who had stood beside Corinne earlier in the week, finally spoke up from the crowd. "Corinne, did you really not have permission? Because if that's the case—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Corinne stammered, "Well, I assumed." "That's not what the flyer said," another voice chimed in sharply. "You wrote that it was booked. That's not an assumption, that's a lie." Faces turned toward Corinne, their earlier excitement now shifting into frustration. Some families began loading their chairs and coolers back into vehicles. Others muttered about wasted time. Corinne's confident smile faltered completely. She glanced at David, then at the crowd, her eyes wide with the realization that her plan was unraveling in front of everyone. David kept his tone calm, but there was no mistaking the firmness in his words. "I'll say it one more time, this cabin is not and never was for HOA use. Corinne knew that. The rest of you shouldn't be punished for her choices, but I will not open this gate." The group dispersed slowly, disappointment and irritation buzzing in the air. Some neighbors gave David an apologetic nod as they left, recognizing that he had been put in an unfair position. By noon, most of the crowd was gone. Only Corinne lingered, standing stiffly beside her car, muttering under her breath as she shuffled papers on her clipboard. David turned back toward the cabin, Max trotting beside him. For the first time in days, he felt relief settle in. Corinne's scheme had been exposed, not by argument, but by her own actions. Still, he had a feeling she wasn't finished yet. The afternoon sun hung high, glinting off the water, but the calm that usually wrapped David's cabin felt disrupted. The cars had gone, the laughter and chatter had dissolved into murmurs of frustration, and Corinne's grand plan had fallen apart. Yet David knew the woman well enough by now to recognize she wasn't one to retreat quietly. By late afternoon, he spotted her again. Her silver sedan was parked across the street from the cabin, and she sat in the driver's seat with her phone pressed to her ear. Every so often, she glanced toward the cabin, scribbling on her clipboard as though plotting her next move. David stood at the porch railing, arms folded. "She's not done," he muttered to Max, who wagged his tail as if in agreement. Sure enough, the following day brought a knock on his door. When David opened it, Karen stood there with a forced smile and a pair of sunglasses perched high on her head. Behind her, 2 HOA board members lingered, Greg included, though he kept his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. "David," Karen began in a tone meant to sound cheerful, "I think we can find a compromise." David raised an eyebrow. "A compromise?" "Yes," she said quickly. "I've been speaking with several neighbors, and while yesterday's misunderstanding was unfortunate, it doesn't have to end badly. What if we arranged a smaller gathering here? Just a few families, nothing like the big crowd. It would demonstrate goodwill on your part and prevent any lingering hard feelings in the community." Greg's voice broke in dryly from behind her. "Karen, yesterday was embarrassing enough. Why are you pushing this?" Karen shot him a sharp look before turning back to David. "I'm offering a chance for us to move forward without unnecessary conflict. You don't want to appear uncooperative, do you?" David sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Karen, let's be clear. There will be no gatherings here. Not small ones, not big ones. This cabin is private. I've said it more than once." Karen's smile tightened. "But surely you see how this makes you look. You're isolating yourself from neighbors, giving the impression you don't care about the community." David's patience began to thin, though his voice stayed calm. "This isn't about appearances. It's about truth. You told people this place was reserved when it was. That's not a misunderstanding, that's dishonesty. And now you're asking me to fix the fallout of your choices. No." Greg shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Karen. "He's right, Karen. Yesterday you crossed a line." Karen snapped, her pleasant tone evaporating. "Fine. If that's how you want to be, David, then don't be surprised when people see you for what you really are. You could have chosen kindness. Instead, you've chosen division." She spun on her heel, storming back to her car, her 2 reluctant board members trailing behind. David closed the door slowly. Max tilted his head, sensing his owner's unease. "I don't like the sound of that," David muttered. The following week proved his instinct correct. A series of small rumors began circulating. At the local grocery store, a neighbor stopped David in the aisle. "Hey, I heard you're planning to sell the cabin to developers. Is that true?" Another neighbor passing by his property called out, "So, are you really turning the cabin into a private resort?" Karen mentioned something like that. David's jaw tightened. Karen was spinning stories now, trying to twist the narrative so that he looked like the selfish one. He tried to brush it off, but the whispers grew louder. Each time he saw Karen at a community gathering spot, she was holding court with a small group, speaking animatedly, her gestures sharp and her expressions dramatic. And each time a few more neighbors looked at David with suspicion or disappointment. By Friday evening, David decided it was time to act. He wasn't going to let Karen's fabrications spread unchecked. He gathered a folder of paperwork, his deed, his permits, even copies of his previous emails with the HOA board. Then he picked up his phone and sent out a message to the entire HOA mailing list. "Meeting at my cabin gate tomorrow morning. Bring your questions, I'll bring the truth." The next day, a crowd gathered once again, but this time David was ready. He stood by the locked gate, folder in hand, as curious neighbors clustered on the gravel road. Karen arrived late, clearly surprised by the gathering. Her confident stride faltered when she saw David holding a stack of papers. "Thank you all for coming," David began, his voice clear. "I've heard the rumors going around. Some say I plan to sell the cabin. Others claim I'm turning it into a resort. None of it is true. I'm here to give you the facts." He held up the deed. "This property is privately owned by me. It's not for sale, not for lease, and not for community events. Karen's claims, whatever form they've taken, are false." Gasps and murmurs swept through the group. All eyes turned to Karen. Karen's face went pale, but she quickly attempted to recover. "He's twisting this. I was only trying to." But David's steady voice overrode hers. "Trying to what? Mislead people, create division. You've had your chance to explain, Karen. Now the truth is out." The neighbors exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time, Karen's credibility had been broken not in private, but in front of the entire community. David folded his papers calmly. "From here on, I won't allow my property to be used as leverage for anyone's schemes. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to ask me directly, but no more rumors." The crowd lingered, quiet but thoughtful. Karen stood frozen, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Her attempt to twist the story had backfired, and everyone knew it. The morning after David's public display of truth, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. For once, Karen wasn't striding around with her usual energy. Neighbors were quieter around her, and some avoided her altogether. David noticed this subtle change when he drove past the local community park and saw her sitting at a bench, tapping her clipboard with a pen but speaking to no one. For a brief moment, David thought she might finally step back, but he should have known better. Karen's determination had a way of flaring brighter the more resistance she met. By midweek, a thick envelope appeared in David's mailbox. Inside was a letter stamped with the HOA's letterhead. The words were precise, written in formal language, but the message was clear. You are hereby notified of potential violations regarding the use of your cabin property. Concerns have been raised regarding compliance with community event rules, property access, and the appearance of your gate. You are required to attend an HOA hearing this coming Saturday to address these issues. David held the letter in his hands, reading it twice, then a third time. His jaw tightened. This was Karen's doing, her new strategy. When rumors had failed, she had turned to rules. If she couldn't claim the cabin through persuasion, she'd try to corner him with regulations. Max, resting nearby, let out a low bark as if he too sensed the change in mood. Looks like we're headed into a bigger fight, buddy, David muttered, folding the letter. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. David prepared carefully, gathering every piece of documentation he could think of: property surveys, photographs of the cabin over the years, records proving his compliance with local zoning and HOA guidelines. He even highlighted sections in the HOA handbook that protected his right to privacy and restricted unauthorized gatherings. Saturday came quickly. David arrived at the HOA office, a small, neat building at the edge of the neighborhood, with Max at his side. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members sat. At the center, Karen presided with a carefully measured expression of authority. The room was full. Neighbors had turned up, curious to see what would unfold. Some whispered quietly, others sat with arms crossed, waiting for answers. Karen opened the session with her usual flair. We are here today to discuss significant concerns regarding David's cabin property. As you all know, community harmony depends on fairness, and there have been repeated issues brought to my attention. These include the misuse of the cabin for gatherings, the obstruction of community access with an oversized gate, and potential neglect of landscaping standards. David's lips pressed into a thin line. He waited patiently until Karen finished, then rose to his feet. First, he said, holding up the deed, this property is not part of the shared community spaces. It's private, fully deeded to me, and has been maintained according to every requirement in the HOA handbook. He laid out photos of the cabin, its neatly kept grounds, and the freshly painted gate. Then he flipped open the handbook, reading aloud the section that explicitly stated homeowners could secure their properties with gates as long as they didn't obstruct public roads. As for gatherings, David continued, the only gatherings that happened here were organized by Karen herself, without my consent. I locked the gate to prevent further unauthorized use, which is not only my right but my responsibility to protect my property. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several neighbors exchanged glances. Greg, seated at the board table, cleared his throat. I've reviewed the rules myself, and I don't see any violation here. Karen's face stiffened. She leaned forward quickly. But the spirit of the community must be upheld. It's not only about technicalities, it's about cooperation and goodwill. David met her gaze firmly. Cooperation isn't built on lies. You told people this cabin was reserved when it was. You spread rumors that I was selling or building a resort. And now, when those didn't hold, you're twisting the rules to force me into compliance where no violation exists. The room fell silent. For once, Karen had no immediate retort. Greg leaned back in his chair, scanning the paperwork David had provided. I think this meeting has shown that David is in full compliance. The board has no grounds to issue penalties. This matter should be closed. Applause broke out from a few neighbors in the back. Others nodded quietly, clearly relieved someone had finally stood up to Karen in such a direct and official setting. Karen, however, wasn't finished. Her voice rose, desperate now. You're making a mistake. If we allow exceptions like this, what message are we sending? That anyone can ignore community values? But her words fell flat. The board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. The more she pressed, the more it became clear she was no longer speaking for the community, only for herself. David gathered his papers calmly, gave a respectful nod to the board, and walked out with Max at his side. Neighbors followed him out, some clapping him on the shoulder, others apologizing for ever doubting him. Standing on the steps outside the office, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle wasn't completely over. He knew Corinne's determination wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time, the tide had turned publicly in his favor. Back inside, Corinne remained at the table, her clipboard resting uselessly in front of her. For once, she had no victory to claim, only silence and the sting of a plan that had unraveled before everyone's eyes. And David knew, as he headed home, that whatever Corinne's next move was, he would be ready. The hearing had ended in David's favor, but he knew Corinne too well to believe she would let things rest. For the next few days, she was unusually quiet, moving around the neighborhood with a tight smile but no comments. Neighbors noticed her change in demeanor and whispered that perhaps she had finally learned her lesson. David, however, wasn't convinced. He had seen the way Corinne's eyes had burned when the board dismissed her claims. That wasn't the look of someone who had given up, it was the look of someone regrouping. Sure enough, by the end of the week, another storm arrived. David was in the cabin's backyard, stacking wood for the fireplace, when a county vehicle rolled up the dirt road leading to his gate. A man in an official jacket stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Afternoon," the man said. "I'm with the county zoning office. We've received a complaint about unapproved construction on this property. Mind if I take a look?" David's eyebrows rose. "Construction? There hasn't been any construction here in years." The inspector gave a polite shrug. "I just have to check things out. A report was filed about a possible unpermitted structure being used for events." David sighed but unlocked the gate and walked him through the property. The inspector looked around carefully, taking photos of the cabin, the woodshed, and the surrounding grounds. After half an hour, he lowered his clipboard. "Everything looks in order. Whoever filed this report may have misunderstood. I'll mark it as resolved." David thanked him, though inside he wasn't surprised. Corinne had escalated the fight beyond the HOA, hoping the county would find something she could not. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood that David had been reported to the county. For many, this crossed a line. Neighbors who had remained neutral began to see the pattern. Corinne wasn't protecting the community, she was targeting David. One afternoon, Greg stopped by David's cabin. He leaned against his truck, shaking his head. "I'll be honest, David, I tried to give Corinne the benefit of the doubt, but this is too much. She's taking things too far. A lot of folks are talking about it." David gave a weary smile. "I figured she wouldn't stop with the HOA, but the truth always comes out." Greg nodded slowly. "It's already coming out. People are starting to see through her. I think she's doing more damage to herself than she realizes." Corinne, however, seemed oblivious. A few evenings later, she held what she called an emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. David chose not to attend, but word traveled fast afterward. She had spent nearly the entire meeting warning neighbors about dangerous precedent and outsiders threatening our values. Her words, once influential, were now met with skeptical stares and whispered conversations. The next morning, David noticed something remarkable. Several neighbors he barely knew stopped by his gate, not to complain but to offer support. One family even brought over a pie, apologizing for ever believing Corinne's stories. "She had us fooled," the mother admitted. "But after the hearing and now the county thing, it's clear she's just making trouble. We're sorry you've had to deal with this." David thanked them sincerely. For the first time, he felt the community shifting in his direction. Corinne's attempts to control the narrative were backfiring, and her credibility was eroding piece by piece. Still, Corinne was not done. A few days later, David returned from running errands in town to find a flyer taped to his gate. In bold letters it read, "Community petition. Remove the cabin for the good of the neighborhood." Beneath the title were several lines for signatures, though only one had been scribbled so far, Corinne's own. David shook his head with a mixture of disbelief and pity. Corinne had now resorted to open theatrics, standing against both evidence and common sense. The flyer didn't intimidate him, but it confirmed what he had suspected all along. Corinne's mission was no longer about rules or community, it was personal. Later that evening, David sat on the cabin porch, Max stretched out at his feet. The air was cool, the sky a fatting shade of orange, and the sound of crickets echoed from the woods. Despite the chaos, Karen continued to stir. David felt calm. "She's running out of ground to stand on," he murmured to Max. "Each move she makes just shows everyone who she really is." And he was right. Even as Karen tried to escalate matters beyond the HOA, her actions were isolating her further. Neighbors who once nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid her. Parents whispered at the park about how exhausting her antics had become. But David also knew something else. People like Karen rarely walked away quietly. The louder the world told her she was wrong, the more desperate she might become. So while David enjoyed that peaceful evening, sipping his coffee as Max wagged his tail, he kept his mind sharp. Because the battle wasn't truly over yet. Karen had one more move left in her, and David suspected it would be the boldest and riskiest one yet. And when it came, he intended to be ready. The petition taped to David's gate might have been laughable at first glance, but David knew it meant one thing. Karen wasn't ready to quit. She had lost credibility with the HOA board, she had failed to get the county on her side, and she was quickly losing the support of her neighbors. That left only one option for her: make a grand, public display. The opportunity came during the community's annual summer gathering. It was the one event where nearly everyone from the neighborhood showed up. Families with kids, retirees with their lawn chairs, and younger couples eager to mingle. The event was hosted at the clubhouse lawn, with food stands, games for the children, and a small stage for announcements. David debated whether to attend. A part of him wanted to avoid the spectacle, but another part knew it was better not to hide. If Karen planned something, it was best to meet it head-on. So, on that warm Saturday afternoon, he walked down from his cabin with Max by his side, earning waves and smiles from several neighbors along the way. When David arrived, he noticed Karen immediately. She was packing near the stage, papers clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes darted around as though she were rehearsing her lines. Some neighbors gave her a wide berth, while others whispered to each other with uneasy expressions. Greg walked over to David and leaned in. "She's up to something. I overheard her telling someone she was going to finally settle this once and for all." David nodded calmly. "Let her try, I'm not worried." Sure enough, halfway through the event, Karen marched up to the stage without waiting for her turn. She tapped the microphone, the speakers squealing as everyone turned toward her. "Attention, neighbors," she began, her voice louder than usual. "I have something important to share. It concerns our community, our safety, and the fairness we all deserve." Children stopped playing, adults paused mid-conversation, and the crowd grew quiet. David felt Max press closer to his leg, sensing the tension. Karen held up a stack of papers. "For too long, one property owner has acted as though he is above the rules. He has locked his gate, denied access to community members, and even humiliated those of us who simply wanted to use what should belong to everyone. This," she jabbed a finger in David's direction, "this cabin has been a problem since the day he bought it. And today I am here to demand that something be done." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked amused. David stood still, saying nothing, letting her words hang in the air. Karen's face flushed as she continued. "I have here a petition," she waved the papers dramatically, "to remove the cabin from our community. If you care about fairness, if you care about our neighborhood, you will sign this petition. Together we can reclaim what should have been ours all along." She thrust the papers out as though expecting a rush of signatures. Instead, silence followed. Neighbors shuffled awkwardly. No one moved forward. A few exchanged glances, then turned back to David, who remained calm, arms folded across his chest. Finally, one voice rang out from the crowd. It was Greg. "Karen, with all due respect, enough is enough. We've all seen what's been happening. David owns that cabin legally. He's not breaking any rules. The only person causing problems here is you." Several people nodded in agreement. A woman holding her toddler spoke next. "You called the county on him and they cleared him. You dragged him in front of the HOA and he proved you wrong. Why are you still doing this?" Karen's expression faltered. She stammered, but this is about fairness. It's about what's right." Another neighbor, an older man who rarely spoke at gatherings, raised his voice. "No, Karen, this is about you trying to control something that isn't yours. We're tired of it." The murmurs grew louder, this time against her. One by one, neighbors turned their backs, walking away from the stage. A group of kids laughed as they ran off toward the games again, the tension dissolving into the summer air. Corinne stood frozen, her petition dangling uselessly at her side. The moment she had planned as her grand triumph had become her public undoing. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for a shred of support, but none came. David finally stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "Corinne, I think it's time you stopped. The cabin isn't yours, it never was, and no amount of petitions or speeches will change that. What you're doing isn't helping this community, it's hurting it." His words were calm, but they carried weight. The crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. For the first time, Corinne had no rebuttal. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Slowly, she gathered her papers, her face pale. Without another word, she stepped down from the stage and walked briskly toward the parking lot. The crowd dispersed, the event carrying on as though her interruption had never happened. Greg clapped David on the shoulder. "Well handled, my friend. You didn't even need to raise your voice." She exposed herself. David gave a small smile. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to be seen. As the evening sun dipped low, laughter and music filled the air again. David sat with neighbors who now greeted him warmly, Max curled at his feet. The battle with Corinne wasn't quite finished. He knew she wouldn't disappear completely, but the tide had turned. She had overplayed her hand, and the community had finally seen it for themselves. For the first time in months, David felt a real sense of belonging. And as he looked around at the people who had once doubted him now standing at his side, he realized Corinne's desperate attempt had done more than fail. It had united the community in ways her control never could. The days following Corinne's public outburst at the summer gathering brought a strange calm to the community. Word of the failed petition spread quickly, and with it, a collective sigh of relief seemed to settle over the neighborhood. People who had once remained neutral or quietly cautious now openly spoke in support of David. The truth was out, and no one could deny it anymore. Corinne had overstepped one too many times. David noticed the change immediately. On his morning walks with Max, neighbors waved more readily. Some stopped to chat, asking how the cabin renovation was coming along or complimenting the improvements he had made. For the first time since moving in, David didn't feel like an outsider looking in. Even Greg commented one evening, "It's funny, isn't it? Corinne tried so hard to turn everyone against you, but in the end, she's the one who lost their trust." David nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. Sometimes people just need to see things play out for themselves. Still, he knew it wasn't the end, not entirely. Corinne hadn't been seen much since the event, but she hadn't left the community either. She had a history of bouncing back after setbacks, and David wouldn't be surprised if she tried again. Yet something about the silence this time felt different. A week later, the HOA board scheduled a special meeting. David received an invitation, though it was clear the meeting's main subject wasn't him. It was Corinne. Word spread that several board members had grown tired of her tactics, and residents had formally requested a vote on her position. The meeting hall filled quickly that evening. Chairs lined the room, every one of them occupied. Corinne arrived late, her steps slower than usual, and she avoided eye contact as she took a seat near the front. David sat quietly in the back, Max at his feet, observing. When the meeting began, the board president cleared his throat. "This session has been called due to numerous complaints regarding the actions of one of our members, Ms. Corinne Richards. We've all witnessed recent events, and it's time we discuss how to move forward." Corinne immediately rose from her chair. "This is ridiculous. I've done nothing but try to protect this community. If you people can't see that, then you're blind." The president remained calm. "Corinne, this isn't about protecting the community. This is about repeated actions that have caused unnecessary division and conflict. You've gone beyond your role, and it's impacted everyone here." A murmur of agreement swept the room. Several neighbors spoke up, each recounting their own experiences, being pressured, receiving constant messages, or feeling intimidated. David remained silent, listening as the voices piled up. For once, he didn't need to defend himself. The community was doing it for him. Finally, the board president announced, "We will now vote on whether Corinne Richards should remain on the HOA board." Hands went up around the room, one after another, until it was clear the decision was unanimous. Corinne had been removed. Her face paled, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But then, perhaps realizing the futility of it, she gathered her bag and left the room without a word. The door shut behind her, and the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Relief spread through the room, people smiled, some even clapped quietly. Greg leaned over to David with a grin. "Well, looks like that's finally settled." After the meeting, several neighbors approached David to thank him, not for fighting Karen, but for handling everything with calm and patience. One older gentleman said, "You didn't have to raise your voice or get nasty. You just stood your ground. That showed all of us who was really in the wrong." David appreciated the words. He had never wanted to be in a feud, but he understood now that standing firm had made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, life around the cabin returned to what David had always imagined it could be. He worked on his renovations. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to lend a hand or share a drink, and Max roamed happily through the yard without fear of another confrontation. The cabin, once a source of conflict, became a place of connection. Families came to visit, friends gathered on the porch, and David finally felt the peace he had been searching for when he first moved there. As summer gave way to autumn, David often sat on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the trees. Max would curl at his feet, the quiet hum of the crickets filling the air. He thought back to everything that had happened, the false claims, the county visits, the petitions, the speeches, and realized that all of it had only strengthened his resolve. Karen had tried to take control of something that wasn't hers, but in the process, she had revealed her own flaws. In the end, she hadn't just failed to claim the cabin, she had lost the very influence she had once held so tightly. For David, the lesson was simple. Sometimes, the best way to deal with unreasonable opposition isn't to fight fire with fire, but to let the truth reveal itself. Patience, persistence, and quiet strength had carried him through. One evening, Greg joined him on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. They sat in companionable silence for a while before Greg spoke. "You know," he said, "I think your cabin's become more than just a cabin. It's kind of a reminder for all of us, about fairness, about standing up when it matters, and about not letting one person control the rest." David chuckled softly. "I'll take that. As long as it stays peaceful, that's all I wanted." He leaned back, watching Max wag his tail at the sound of an owl in the distance. For the first time since moving in, David felt that peace was no longer just a hope, it was his reality. And as the autumn breeze rustled through the trees, he knew the cabin's gate didn't just protect his property. It stood as a symbol of boundaries, fairness, and the quiet strength of knowing when to hold your ground.